Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. Average Folks in the Afterlife, number 80. And we're continuing on directly from number 79 with David Spangler, Apprentice to Spirit, and one of many fine books that David has put together over the last 40 odd years. This one's fairly recent to me. Read a lot of the others many years ago in the 70s and the 80s. And this one came out in 2011. So as I said, continuing right on, talking about mostly about his personal psychic experiences and what he experienced through his guide, John. Another way in which John gave me learning experiences was through what I thought of as field trips. When John first appeared and spoke of training me in collaboration with an inner school, I had fantasies of traveling out of my body and attending classes in some university somewhere in the astral or celestial realms. That turned out not to be the case. But what John did was something similar in principle, if not in technique. In effect, we would blend our consciousnesses together using the process I've called loving mind. And once there was a unity between us, he would go somewhere, taking my consciousness with him. It was like riding piggyback on his mind. Then, wherever we went, I saw through his eyes. It was a kind of reverse channeling, I suppose, in which I entered his body rather than the other way around. Sometimes we would take a field trip in response to a question I or someone else would have, sometimes to meet a particular being whose characteristics John wanted me to know, or who had information that was part of my learning. Most often we traveled to establish lines of energy and navigational landmarks I could later use on my own. This was the equivalent of being a new person in a neighborhood and having a friend drive you around to show you the layout of the streets, where the stores were, and the useful shortcuts one could take. And I learned that for John, travel on the inner was not so much from place to place, but from one being to another. For John, all places were the manifestation of living intelligences. We moved through life rather than through space, and relationship was the road we traveled on. Again, it's hard to know just how to describe some of these trips, since where we went wasn't exactly a place, and what John showed me wasn't exactly a thing or a person, but more like a condition of consciousness or a convergence of energies, like seeing where different rivers come together in a landscape. Often the purpose of these trips was for me to discern the effect of each convergence or condition on my own consciousness, so they were really exercises in self-knowledge. But sometimes they were remarkable and etched themselves on my memory. For example, once on a field trip, John took me to a place that was dimly lit and had a depressing feeling overall. It looked to me like the outskirts of a small town comprised of low buildings, none higher than 3 stories. People were moving about, but the whole place had a feeling of being run down and rather ramshackle. You guessed the lower astral? Yes, you guessed correctly. Quote, "This is a place in the post-mortem realms to which a person may go after physical death," he said. "In this instance, it is for souls who cannot see much beyond their own selfish interests. They are caught within themselves, and some have died in despair and depression, having concern and pity for no one but themselves. They care little for their environment. The light of the higher realms is painful for them, so they come here until they are ready to move on. There are dedicated souls who attend them here in whatever way they can to help them, and they come to that point of liberation and advancement. But there is one in particular I wish you to meet." Though she didn't speak, I felt greeted and welcomed by her. But then the perspective changed, and instead of seeing her standing with John and me on the dimmer outskirts of this town, we were standing inside her. The whole place seemed to be inside her. Quote, "She is the presence who creates and sustains this realm," John said. "You might think of her as a goddess of sorts, though none that you would know by name. She is one of many such beings who use their own living energies to create a place dedicated to the welfare and succor of others. In your world, a wealthy woman might pay to have a hospital built. Here, this being, who is rich in life and compassion and spirit, is the hospital. This realm exists because it is needed as a place of healing, but she is its architect and its life. This is not just a place, you see, but a living presence. Then the perspective shifted again, and John and I were once again standing on the outskirts of the depressing town, and the woman who was standing with us. She smiled at us, and I could feel the presence of her love, as one might feel the presence of an ocean of unplumbed depth. Then she vanished. Quote, "She takes unto herself the convictions of the people who are here," John said. Left to themselves, their self-pity and depression could implode into a hard nugget of selfishness and despair, making it very difficult for them to find liberation and move to higher levels of consciousness. But held within her love and spirit, their energy is kept lively and moving in ways they cannot yet do for themselves. It is as if they have forgotten how to breathe, and she is breathing for them. This will make possible their eventual liberation from their self-enclosed states. Over the years, John showed me many similar instances of beings giving themselves in service and compassion to humanity. In fact, if there was a consistent theme to what John wanted to show me, it was that we are loved and cherished as a species and individuals. For all our problems and challenges, for all our suffering and violence, it would be so much worse were this compassionate and often self-sacrificing help, partnering, not consistently present from the invisible worlds. In exploring and learning about the inner worlds, John's intent was not to take me everywhere. This would have been like taking me on a walking tour of the whole earth. And yeah, I've found that myself. There's a lot to see. Even he was not conversant with all the possibilities of consciousness and the various states of being and realms one might find in the non-physical dimension. What he wanted for me was to learn to make maps that would help me to navigate. Such maps are very personal. Travel on the inner for me is through resonance, relationships, and connections. For example, one place to which John took me was akin to a reference library on the inner. The Hall of Knowledge or the Hall of Records you can read about in some writers' descriptions of the inner worlds. However, in the way John taught me, it wasn't a place at all, but a being. I didn't go to a library, I attuned to a librarian. I didn't go there along a road as much as I summoned up the felt sense in my body and mind of a relationship with the librarian, and then I would find myself in its presence. But the peculiar quality of this relationship, the felt sense through which I would attune to it, was unique to me. Millions of other people might also have a relationship with this being or with the library it represents, but none would have precisely the same relationship I have, any more than anyone else who has exactly the same relationship with each of my children or with my friends that I have. This is why a map of such relationships is personal. So, I find that quite a unique view. There are many references and accounts in the spiritualist and theosophical literature of, how shall I say, advanced beings constructing some of the landscapes of the astral plane that recent arrivals live in. And it's regarded as a creative act that you learn, a mentally creative act. And there's many references to it. Not many descriptions of constructing an entire landscape, although I can think of one in a book about the Devas, and we'll get to that another time. But as I say, references and some quotes and some descriptions of 3 or 4 people getting together after making plans, projecting the image of a building onto a landscape and having it slowly come bit by bit together. They're often deceased architects, although not always, who love to do that sort of thing without going through all the incredible rigmarole you have to go through here on Earth to do it. Um, I, I did include a description of such a thing, such an experience in An American in Heaven, where Melanie is walking somewhere and she comes across people creating a building. So that is more the references that you get, but to have this description of a landscape or a sphere of some magnitude being inside the mental or causal body of a fairly advanced being who is taking on this task as part of their education is relatively unique in my experience. And later, Spangler or his guide John makes the comparison to Gaia, the ensouling spirit of our planet, and being a being that encompasses and shelters all our experiences as we go through all the ups and downs of our incarnations. And you will find other references in the literature to Gaia as a being. But it's a good comparison to make. You can see the slow but gradual greater responsibilities that we can take as we move through the levels toward, how shall we say, complete graduation. There's lots of stops on the way where you can exercise your innate patience, compassion, creativity. Lots. And that's just one of them. Section here on David experiencing how John sees things. There, John's desire to give me an understanding of inner worlds and the needs and desires of the group that had hired me came together in a perfect synergy. He's talking about a group of esoteric students that had existed for a number of years in California and then heard about David and asked him to become their sort of guide. That's what he's referring to. They had been studying a variety of books on esoteric cosmology and had a great many questions that they hoped I could answer. They were eager to explore these issues with me and see the world through John's eyes. So how did John see things through his eyes? Quote, if I were to draw a map of your life, there are many ways I could do so, depending on my starting point. I could map your life chronologically. I could map it according to your interests and desires. I could map it geographically by the places you've lived and visited. I could map it by your relationships. Each map would be accurate insofar as it went, and each map would be incomplete. Each map would be useful for a particular purpose. The same principle is true even of what you call the inner worlds, which to me are more accurately described as realms of extended dimensions. How you map these realms depends not only on what you see, but on what you wish to see and what you can see. I cannot show you the entirety of these inner worlds. I do not have the ability, nor could you perceive or understand it all, even if I did. So we must be selective. We will base that selection on what we wish to accomplish, and that is to lay a foundation for partnership. In other words, if I wanted to find gold, I pick a map that shows where the deposits are likely to be and how to get to them. I don't pick a map to find banana groves. Most esoteric cosmologies or maps I have encountered over the years have been hierarchical. That's true. Although the people that present those say this is only a useful image, they will say that it's not really a hierarchy of higher and higher levels, that they all blend in together. But when you're trying to put that on a page in a book, you inevitably wind up with a little sort of either a pie chart or something that looks like a 15-story building. The simplest models begin with the sacred at the top and then progress down through a series of emanations, one plane giving birth to the next until finally the physical realm emerges at the bottom of the process. This gives a picture like a wedding cake with many layers, arranged hierarchically from higher to lower, from the spiritual to the mundane. It is a model like this that often leads people to assume that a non-physical being coming from one of the higher layers in the cake must also automatically be more developed in virtue, wisdom, and spirituality than a physical person on the lowest levels, an assumption that my own experience has never borne out to be true. John did not deny that some realms emerged from others in the evolution of the cosmos, but he said this was not the whole picture. It described part but not all of the whole relationship between the worlds. Quote, think of an ancient house. In the beginning there was only one central room over the years, but other rooms have been added, making the house higher and larger. In a way, you can say that all these other rooms have emanated from the original house, but once added, they become unique rooms in themselves, part of the wholeness that makes a house a home. No room is better than another simply because it is older. No room is less simply because it is a newer addition. Each room offers something the others do not. Each room is vital and precious. Some rooms are larger, some may be more used, some may be more comfortable, but all are part of the home. Because you happen to be in one room, it doesn't make you better or superior to someone in a different room. It simply gives you access to the peculiar resources that that room offers, which may indeed be unavailable but helpful to a person in another room. Remember this, whatever room you are in, you are at home. There are many mansions in my Father's house. Indeed there are. In traditional esoteric and metaphysical writings, the physical plane is often described as lower, slower, denser than the other levels of existence. Again, John often said this was hardly the whole picture. Quote, to say that your world is made up of a denser vibration or of a denser energy is correct from my perspective as far as it goes. But it does not go far enough. It implies that this is a failing of your world, but it is not. It is a condition that allows certain states of consciousness and creativity to exist that would not do so otherwise. Your so-called density is not a mark against you. It is an environmental condition that makes your world what it is, for better or for worse, like the bright sun of the desert or the snows of the Arctic. If you live in a desert and prefer the snow, then you will find it unpleasant. If you enjoy the heat and the dryness, then it will be paradise. But in either place, you will be able, if you choose, to love, to think, to be creative. Forms of life grow and thrive in the desert that would die in the Arctic and vice versa. Your consciousness is limited in some ways compared with mine, but not in others. Never think less of yourself or any other because you are in the physical embodiment. Your world is rich in information. It is rich in possibility. The very existence of such diversity, separation, and difference heightens the possibility for conflict and misunderstanding between you. This is true. But it also heightens the possibility of creativity, emergence, and newness. You may be dense in energy, but you're also dense in possibilities and potentials. We all live in a universe designed for creativity. This is as true for you in your world as it is for me in mine. From John's point of view, a perspective shared by many physical people as well, the Earth is a living being. In recent years, British scientist James Lovelock proposed a similar idea and called it the Gaia hypothesis. You may not know that, but it's the case. And James Lovelock lived to a ripe old age, and he may still be alive. And the last interview I heard with him, he was quite the gloomy environmentalist at that point, for the usual reasons that they're gloomy. And saying things like, well, I'm glad I'm leaving the stage fairly soon. I don't want to see what's going to happen in 20 years. He was a man of 90 plus years. So, each innovative thinker does have their limitations. Called it the Gaia hypothesis after the Greek goddess of the earth. Subsequent research and experimentation have come up with enough supportive evidence that this idea has been graduated from being hypothetical to being the Gaia theory. In Lovelock's theory, though, the kind of organism that Gaia may be is fairly primitive. From the inner point of view, Gaia, or the world soul, is a highly complex, powerful, loving, and creative spiritual presence, one dedicated to creating a multi-tiered, multi-vibrational environment for the nurturing and evolution of consciousness. In effect, there are two kinds of inner worlds. Some of them are environments contained within the subtle energy fields of Gaia, much like a human being has an aura composed of different layers of energy and vibration. The other kind of inner world would be equivalent to our spiritual nature, our souls and spirit and inner sacredness. Thus, in traveling through the non-physical domains, one might move in an energy direction, though the dimensions making up the subtle bodies of the whole world soul, or one might move in a spiritual direction, through dimensions of increasing depths of spirit towards greater states of unity and wholeness. And sometimes you might travel in both directions at once, since every subtle level has a spiritual counterpart. The integration of all these realms and directions were what contributed to the wholeness of the planet and the world soul. I had a vivid experience of this with John. He took me to a place where the energy field of the Earth ended and the cosmos began, a kind of inner equivalent to where the atmosphere of the Earth gives way to the vacuum of space. In my mind's eye, we seemed to be standing on a cliff edge at the edge of the world, overlooking the depths of space. Though I knew this to be only a representation my mind was creating to symbolically represent where we were. I could feel the quality of differentiation between where we were and the cosmos beyond. We were at a definite boundary. Behind me, earthward, I felt what seemed like a warm green energy, as if a green star were at my back, and I took this to be how I was interpreting the energy of life that the planet holds. In front of me, however, space was not cold and dark, but filled with inviting and friendly energies, which nevertheless were different. Looking around, I saw that John and I were in the company of strange-looking beings. They were green, flame-like entities that reminded me of tall blades of grass, pointed at the top and possessing a pair of eyes. As I looked at them, I could see humanoid shape appearing within one of them, as if emerging out of the flame or the blade of grass, and I realized that it was adjusting itself to a shape it thought I would be more comfortable with. But I let it know that I didn't need to do that, so it resumed its more amorphous, flaming grass shape. As I watched, some of these beings leaped off the cliff and soared away into the cosmos, their flight seeming to me to be accompanied by music. I wasn't sure whether this was coming from them or from the cosmos itself as they entered it. Of course, I'm sure that from the perspective of these beings, the whole experience looked and sounded very different to them than it did to me. John said, "These are emissaries of the world soul, embodiments of its life and thought as it relates to other worlds in the cosmos. I suppose you might think of them as particular kinds of nature spirits that are related to the universe beyond the planet." Then he said, "This is the energy boundary of the world, the edge of what in you would be your aura. But now observe this." With that, he gathered me up and we moved in a different direction altogether, what I would now think of as soulward or spiritward. We were moving into a spiritual dimension, and here the cliff disappeared. There was no sense of a boundary, only of a much larger inclusive field. The distinction between earth and cosmos fell away, or at least receded, so that what I felt was a profound unity. If we move in this direction, John said, we enter into the unity that the world soul experiences with the cosmos. In your terms, this is a spiritual or mystical state. Here the love of the world is not mediated by any particular being, but flows uninterrupted out into the larger whole, just as the love of that larger whole flows uninterrupted back into the world. Which is the reality? I asked. Why, both, of course. And others that I cannot show you because you would not be able to grasp them. The point is that the world, like you and I, exists in different states of beingness and relationship with its environment. Some of these states emphasize distinction and difference, and others emphasize unity and oneness. None is better than the other. All are necessary. The partnership of the world with the cosmos occurs along these avenues of relationship, and that is true for you and me in our partnership as well. There is the universal and the individual, the vast and the particular, and both are needed, both are real. Ah, yes, another example from his Findhorn years. He's talking about going to the community in Findhorn and becoming quite involved in it for 2 to 3 years and becoming a worker, a participant, a lecturer, um, and an interesting experience here connected to that. On the other hand, Findhorn offered me an opportunity that I had not had in California. As much as the group there had supported and helped me, they all led busy lives in the world. We all met once a week at the most, and sometimes less frequently than that. There were times when John would tell me something or I would have what seemed a particularly important experience, and there would be no one to share it with. I would be unable to follow through or explore the experience more deeply. Here's an example. One morning I was lying in bed in my apartment in California. I was in that in-between state of being that's not quite asleep and not quite awake. My mind had definitely not yet begun to grasp the reins of the day's thoughts and activities, and there was a delicious sense of just floating and relaxing. I should remind you that that state has been referred to by the theosophist Charles Ledbetter, that anonymous sort of floating and relaxing state, as a time or a moment when we're most connected to our higher self, because that's often how higher self experiences things. Anyway, just before you sort of get that personal identity thing in the morning. Taking advantage of the situation, John appeared to me and said, "I want to show you something. There's a presence I want you to meet." With that, we were off on one of our field trips. I found myself immersed in verdant life, surrounded by varying shades of green. It was like being in the middle of a green fog and in the midst of, not of living creatures, but of the power and vitality of life itself. I had a sense of immense presence, a bit like being at the base of a mountain, only more so. I felt a multitude of impressions and images pressing in on me, more than I could process or interpret. Then the fog parted and I gained a different perspective. Things began to fall into place, or at least my mind began to fashion an image it could comprehend and use to organize what I was experiencing. I was seeing the world from a distance, but it did not at all resemble the images of the planet from space. Everything remained green, and yet there was no differentiation between oceans or continents. It was looking like a biomass of the earth, presented as a collage of images in various life forms, from microbes to moose, from protozoa to pine woods, with fish, birds, animals, humans, plants, all represented. This was very impressionistic, with a few sharp details, including landscapes such as forests and mountains. And underneath the green light was a deeper core of light that to my sight was a reddish gold, conveying a sense of love. Quite beyond the imagery, however, was a sense of presence. It felt vast, but at the same time it felt intimate. I did not feel it diminished by its vastness. I felt that whatever this was, I was part of it and it was part of me. This, John said, is the world soul. It is the life and consciousness that infuse the world, giving of itself to support all the other lives that are evolving on the planet. Humanity is helping it to incarnate, but its gift back is to enable you to develop a planetary consciousness. This is an essential part of your destiny as a species, a destiny which you are confronting at this time in history. Developing a planetary consciousness. Very early on in my journey, mid-70s, I was still very much into poetic forms of language. I wrote a peculiar little essay, which is quite hard to understand, but it's called Erudition and the Individual Planet. And I think, of course, I'd read some of Spangler's early books, like Reflections on the Christ and that sort of thing. By that point, I would think. So I probably had some notions of a planetary consciousness. But just a little reference there. Um, so after about 3 years at Findhorn, he feels a pull to return to the States, that his time there with the Findhorn community was coming to an end. And of course, it continues on to this day and is a thriving, intentional New Age community, which takes visitors, paying visitors, I believe, and is much more sort of developed than it was in those days. But a small point toward the end of the Spangler doesn't talk much about regular sort of psychic experiences that you get from most psychics, but there is an interesting little thing that happens here. Talks about going back to the States. It was in April '73 when I returned, just in time for the beginning of the Senate Watergate hearings into the cover-up of the break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters during the presidential campaign of the previous year. The previous month, one of the burglars, James McCord Jr., had written a letter to the judge in the case, John Sirica, naming Attorney General John Mitchell as the head of the operation. This implicated the White House, and now the senators wanted to know, quote, what the president had known and when. I had followed Nixon's career with some interest over the years. He'd come to Nuasir, that's when he was a child, in Morocco, referred to previously, on a tour of American air bases there, and when he'd been vice president, and I'd met him very briefly as a part of a Cub Scout troop that had greeted him. Then I had an interesting precognitive vision of him on election night 60, where he had run against Kennedy. I had a vision of which I was in a hotel room with Nixon and his family watching the election returns. I became aware of a figure standing next to me and turning, saw that it was a very old Chinese Mandarin dressed in an elaborate gold and red silk robe. He looked at me and nodded in Nixon's direction, saying, "He will not win. This is not his time. But a time will come when he will be president. He has a destiny." Of course, years later as president, Nixon became famous for opening new diplomatic relationships with China, and I often wondered if the Mandarin I'd seen in my vision had been an aspect of Nixon's soul and that he had been Chinese in a previous life. Is there any more of that? I can't remember. No, I think that's it. Of course, there's lots more in this book, but I've tried to cover the more significant parts. I mean, obviously, he talks for many pages about developing a planetary consciousness as an individual and helping us to do the same. And I think a lot of us are doing that. The internet helps because we can find out, if we so choose, how people around the world feel about certain things, either through social media or sites based in other countries. You know, Japanese sites, Indian sites, Dutch sites, sites in South America. And those of us that live in urban environments, like myself, we have the daily experience of interacting, and I do, with people from all over the world. Where I live in the greater Toronto area is so multicultural, you would not be exaggerating to call it the United Nations. It is quite remarkable. And it's hard to think of an area of the planet that isn't represented here. It really is. Asia, Middle East, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Scandinavia, Russia, South America, all sorts. It's just amazing to be here at this time. So, in a small way, and I know that the similar case is true of large urban areas in North America and Europe. The large cities in Western Europe are like this. and Britain and North America. You know, it's very, very similar. And some places are having trouble coping with this because of unemployment and lack of cultural integration, and the breeding grounds for radicalism. We know all about that. And I think part of that is probably to do with socialization and the state of the economy. And here in Canada in the last few years, our economy has been strong, especially in large urban areas that have got a wide swath of production and service industries. People can find jobs here and support themselves and support their families. So that for me is a bit of planetary consciousness. They are obviously doing out of body travel, and that's another whole aspect. And I've talked about that elsewhere. We'll get back to that for sure. And not sure what the next one in this series will be, but there will be one, as you can see, and in the pink again, and have plenty of energy to be going about numerous tasks at the same time. Multitasking, as they say in the economy. So with that, I wish you all well, and until next time, bon voyage.